All right. Hello, people of Derbycon. Welcome to the three-way. Hello, random YouTube viewer. My name is Vadim. This is Nick.
I'm Nick.
Do not advertise your book.
So, like shameless self-plug, I am writing a book on game hacking. So this is a preview copy. There's a preview copy for auction at Hackers for Charity. They're good people, so go give them money and buy the preview copy. It's first 3 chapters. Book will be out in a few months. Other than that, I just own Userland, and he researches malware. And from that, we came up with this talk. So we hope you guys like it. I'm going to give the mic over to him. He's going to start the talk out.
So what this talk is about, we wrote a tool. We wrote a generic unpacker for Windows malware. And we call it the Packer Attacker. And why did we write it? Because we wanted to analyze malware at scale. And we couldn't find good open source tools to do that. We could have bought some commercial solutions. There are a couple of services there. But there are 2 problems with them. First is we actually wanted to know what exactly are we doing. And those things are proprietary and closed source. And second, we thought it'd be fun to develop it ourselves and share with the community for everybody to use, for independent researchers and academics and so on. So, yeah, let's begin with a bit of background. So we use the term packers really loosely. What we mean by that is the following thing. So when malware executes on your machine, it usually starts with self-unpacking code that extracts the actual malicious payload from somewhere. It could be a resource section, it could be hidden somewhere in the PE header, or scattered across the binary. Then it does some unpacking or decryption or both, and then it transfers control to that code. And there are many ways to do that. First, malware can write it into a separate file and then launch that file. But we're not interested in that because this is trivial. You just need to watch for changes to the file system. What we're more interested in is what happened in the memory. And there are several ways. There are actually many ways to do that. But most of the time, there are kind of 3 approaches. First is they can be an empty PE section where malware extracts that, or they can be, or it extracts the payload to the heap and then executes from the heap. It can replace the whole executable image, and it can inject into another process. These are kind of 3 generic ways that our tool can handle. So let's look at them kind of in a bit more detail, and let's just think what a generic unpacker should do. So when executing from the heap, what happens is malware allocates some memory and assigns it execution privileges. Now then, it unpacks the payload to that region and then transfers control. Again, this is a very generic diagram that it can jump to that code. It can call it as a function. It can mess with the stack or exception handlers, whatever. So in this case, the generic unpacker should track the allocations and watch out for memory that is accessible for execution. And when the execution in that memory region is detected, dump that memory region, where, as we suggest, as we think the malicious payload should be. So when replacing an image, again, it would usually allocate some memory and unpack the code there, because that's easier to operate with that payload then. And then just overwrites the image section by section and jumps to new entry point. In this case, a generic unpacker should track changes to the executable image, and then if changes were made and execution in the code section was detected, then dump the whole image.
And that's like what UPX does. For instance, it has like an empty PE section, and then it writes the new code to that PE section without like any import table or whatever. It resolves all that stuff before unpacking, and then executes from there.
either that, or it can just unmap all the sections and then map them again to maybe even to different location. And finally, process injection. This is the easiest one. If malware does inject code into another process, then that code is important. So just dump everything. So there are many ways to implement a generic unpacker. One would be a kernel driver. That's actually a very good way to do that, except you need driver guys to do that, which we aren't. Then another way to do that is Intel Pin tool, which is an interesting thing. Is a just-in-time compiler that basically compiles every instruction and then executes them. It's very powerful and kind of non-intrusive, really, but it's really slow. So, kind of the point of the generic unpacker is to make malware analysis faster. So we didn't want to go with that. And finally, we thought hooking is a reasonable solution. It's kind of easy to bypass, but at least it's easier to implement as well. Well, it's just something that we're most familiar with, and so we went with this. We used Microsoft Detours. It's free. Everybody can download it. Everybody can use it, and everybody can reproduce what we're presenting now. So I'll shut up and let Nick walk you through the implementation.
Okay, so our tool, Packer Attacker, it is Captain Hook because it's hook based, and there's a packer. I'm gonna explain how it beats up that packer now. So the magic takes place inside of a DLL that we inject into the malware. So the malware is going to be suspended. We're going to inject a DLL into it, let it run. So we use a mix of traditional detour hooking. That's what we use Microsoft Detours for. And with that detour hooking, we use vectored exception handler hooking. So this is a trick where you remove privileges from memory. So like if you want to detect when memory is being written to, you remove the write privilege from the memory and it'll throw an exception when it happens. You can catch it, restore write privileges, and let it execute. That's the type of hooking we use for execution and writing. The malware must run to completion once we inject the DLL. If the malware detects that something's wrong, if it knows it's in a sandbox, if it knows it's in a VM, if it doesn't hit CNC so it doesn't unpack, any of these reasons will make it not work, right? Because there's nothing to detect if it decides not to unpack. And for obvious reasons, you run this in like a malware analysis VM. We run our tests in a hardened VM. So I forget what a Pbased, I think is what it's called. There's a tool called Pbased that you can use to check. It does like all the normal detection techniques to see if it can see a VM. So you harden the VM, use that. If it can't see it, you assume malware can't see it. And then it makes it easier because if malware detects a VM, it's not going to unpack and you're going to think the tool failed. So that's one of the prerequisites. So we can't actually see the title. So up at the top, it says implementation and unpacking for heap-based packers. So for heap-based packers, like we explained before what they're going to do, they're going to unpack to executable heap memory and just execute from there. So the first step, we're going to hook NT protect virtual memory and NT allocate virtual memory. And when we have hooks on those functions, we can see when a page is given VM execute, either at allocation time or after the fact. When it's given VM execute, we can actually just remove that VM execute from the memory. Like if it was read write execute, we just let it be read write. We don't give it execute. And then we have a vectored exception handler, and we catch DEP exceptions, data execution prevention exceptions. When we see a DEP exception come through, we know execution happened on memory that wasn't executable. So then we'll check if it was one of our tracked pages that we removed execution from, then it was probably unpacked there. So we dump that from memory. This is the implementation for PE-based packer. So this is a bit trickier because the PE section at when the process starts up, like when it forks, it's going to set everything up, set all the memory and stuff up according to the characteristics in the PE header. So if the PE header says this section has these characteristics that mean read, write, execute, then it's going to be given execute before our hooks are there. And so what we're going to do is as soon as our hooks are injected, we're going to loop over every PE section. If we see something that has execute, well, that's fine. There should be some executable code. but it shouldn't also be writable. By default, the entry point section is not writable. So if you see something that's writable and executable, instead of tracking execute, you remove the write privilege from it. And then within the vectored exception handler, we'll get an access violation if something tries to write to that PE section. It can execute just fine until something tries to write to it. We get an exception, and then we switch. We remove execution now because we assume this write wrote the code, and then next time it executes, our vectored exception handler will catch it again after the write, and now we know if code was unpacked, we dump that out of memory to disk, and that'll catch UPX and all these other packers that work this way. And then there's the injection paste packers. Whether it's injecting DLL, doing a manual map to another process, whatever it does, we'll catch that just by, because there's only two entry points to that really, which is NT write virtual memory and NT map view of section. Those are the only real ways to get memory into another process from user mode. So you just hook those, you dump everything. Everything should be important in that case, so just dump the entire buffer from memory. So we did run into some problems that took a while to figure out. At one point, some malware just, like, it wasn't throwing dep exceptions. We didn't know why, and then we was like, oh, dep's a flag in the P header, and if it's not set at compile time, we won't get the exceptions. So there's a function for that, just call set process dep policy Windows API function enable dep, done. Okay, another problem we ran into is sometimes access violation exceptions just occur. The malware could be terrible, there could be a bug in the malware, it could be using it to transfer control flow. There's a bunch of reasons why access violations occur. And like the first iteration of our vectored exception handler just wasn't handling this well. So sometimes it would see an access violation that wasn't due to one of our memory hooks and get confused, and it would cause the malware to like brick. It wouldn't run or whatever. So we had to deal with that and make sure to only handle exceptions we've triggered ourselves. Another one is like dep exceptions that sometimes they just don't trigger properly. We never really figured out why. There's like, it's only like when NT create thread happens. When a new thread happens on non-executable memory, sometimes the dep exceptions acted weird. Instead of figuring out why, we just hooked NT create thread because we can detect execution that way too. So why not? Another problem is when we enforce dep, we can break malware. Because if the malware is compiled without dep on, then it might have just been unpacking to writable memory and executing there and never giving it execute. And that would still work when dep is turned off. But now that we've enforced dep and we're to track stuff, it can make the malware not run sometimes. So like with access violations, we just had to be like very sure that dep exceptions are ones we're tracking. And if we get a dep exception that occurs that isn't a result of one of our memory hooks, we need to just let it go. We restore page execute so it can execute, and then we let it go without doing anything. And that kind of simulates deplessness. And then some packers are two-stage, like malware downloads something, drops it to the file system, runs that unpacks. So to detect that, we just hook create process internal. We make it create any processes that's suspended, inject into them, and then unsuspend. This way, we will just keep like recursively going into any new processes and dumping from there. And the biggest problem so far, the code just keeps getting more complex, more unreadable. There's all these weird hooks going on, all these like flag checks of memory, all this other stuff. So the only solution we found for that is to just like refactor and cry, because there's like, yeah, it's getting ugly, and I really don't know how to fix it at this point. So the what, the how, and the where, like we've already talked about, is the packer attacker. The hooks are written in C++, injectors in C++. We have some Python bootstrapping scripts for testing, like dispatching stuff to VMs. You guys are going to see that soon in a demo. Visual Studio 2010 is what I used. Microsoft detours. It only works in 32-bit because you need to like pay $10,000 to get 64-bit detours, or write your own hooking engine, or use Madshi, which is still like $1,000. So 32-bit only. And we use VMware Fusion for our testing. We have a GitHub repo right there. I will hand it back to Vadim. He's going to show you guys a live demo and talk about the experiments and our success rates.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we threw together the very first prototype, and we wanted to test the efficiency. So we set up this little testing environment. So we downloaded a bunch of malware from virusshare.com. Concretely, we downloaded the torrent with Zeus and Citadel-based malware. And so is it an amazing, best in the world malware share? No. Is it statistically representative? It's probably not. But there is no data set that would be 100% statistically representative. But the big advantage of virus share is that you can download a lot of malware in a torrent. And we chose Zeus and Citadel pack because there are many samples collected for like 5 years or so. And these are banking Trojans that are very well studied, and it's easy to automatically check whether the unpacking was complete or not, because different malware artifacts such as registry keys, maybe user agent strings and stuff are known, so we could check for that. So we then filtered. We only included 32-bit executables, so DLLs are not supported for now, and 64-bit is not supported for now. So we put everything into database, and then for each experiment we sample 350 files randomly from that dataset and submit it to our test virtual machines. The number 350 has no scientific rationale. So why we picked it is because on early stages of development, things would just go wrong all the time. And we had to manually go through all that malware, manually recreate the unpacking steps and find out what went wrong and how should we adjust our unpacking algorithm. So 350 is about the number we were comfortable with going manually in a few days. So, and then we had this Mac with VMware Fusion on it. We hardened it a little bit, and we just tested regularly, constantly, and we're adjusting our scripts, and then we logged everything into the results journal. So what is the packer attacker? What are the components? First of all, it's the DLL called packer attacker hook. It's basically the core engine of the basically it is an unpacker. Then the packer attacker exe, which is just an executable that you start, and it injects the DLL into malware, and it works very simple at the moment. It doesn't have any API or user interface. You just put both into your path, and you create a folder called dumps in the C drive, and that's it. And you're probably gonna need Microsoft Visual C++ for distributable, and that's enough to run a packer attacker on your machine. So when we were setting up our VMs, this is just the kind of guidelines we were using. First of all, we would not recommend installing VMware VirtualBox tools in the guest, because lots of malware detect those by just simply looking into the registry and looking for just names, VMware, Oracle, or whatever, and it's really trivial to find. So this is a no-no. And then our virtual machines communicate only to the host, so it's an internal network. And before actually running the large-scale experiments, we used the ParanoidFish to check how prone our machines were to the bypasses. Now, the important thing here is that ParanoidFish is actually a pretty good sort of a testing tool for your VMs, and it's really hard to satisfy all of the checks that it does. But what we'd recommend to do is once you're reasonably good, once you pass most of the checks, with a couple we didn't pass, but that's fine, because there was something that malware will detect and won't run. So you cannot reach 100% success rate here. Now, and then we run it in our testing setup, and here's the results we've got. in almost 90% of cases, we were able to dump hidden code. It doesn't mean it's an absolutely perfect, readable, well-aligned executable, but there are chunks of actual malware, of actual malicious payload that you still can work with and extract some strings, maybe some other indicators of compromise, maybe crypto constants and so on. About 45% of all the malware we tested, we were able to dump actually the full PE, which is interesting because it means that almost half of the times malware in this data set just at some point has the full PE in the memory that we could dump. As Nick mentioned, enforcing DEP or DEP caused a side effect. Malware would crash. And the good thing is that most malware would crash after we already dumped it, or after we already dumped the payload. But still, we have around 30% of crashes. So, well...
Not all of them were due to the DEP enforcement? Like, we had some crashes?
Yeah, some crashes... Yeah. Some crashes happen because of us. Some of them is just bad malware, maybe too old malware that was written for older systems. We were running on Windows 7, by the way, and about 4% is just errors. We have no idea what happened. Error. So error is we have logs. We have two kind of stuff that the packer attacker generates. We have dumps and we have logs. And in the log, we can indicate either the crash happened, or if your log is empty, then something went wrong, and this is what we count as errors. Well, there was nothing there. It didn't execute. So some interesting statistics. We thought number of hidden code chunks. Around 13 in average, but standard deviation, which should be STD, not STF. Standard deviation is 12.5. So statistically speaking, this isn't really a good data set. But then again, it's impossible to find good data set. And maximum was 62. And also we noticed that only 20% of malware in our data set used process hollowing, which is interesting because most of the time this is the most popular, most common technique. We'd expected more.
Also, when we say we have like 13 dumps, it doesn't necessarily mean there was 13 things unpacked. Sometimes it can just mean that like it's unpacked in like a huge piece of code and it executes in 13 different places and they're non-sequential. They weren't all located together and we just don't have a way to glue those together. So it doesn't mean there's 13 different pieces of malware being unpacked, just that it executed in 13 different places on the same malware.
And here's how there's a number of extracted code chunks distributed. So the horizontal axis is malware samples, and the vertical is a number of hidden chunks. And interestingly, we have these two distinct stripes. What does it mean? I don't know. It's just, but it's just a pattern. It's an interesting pattern. We thought worth mentioning.
This one's winning.
Yeah, maximum is 62. So one malware has 62 chunks of code executed before it jumped to the payload. So let me show you that thing in action.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
What does 0 indicate to you guys? 0 seconds.
No dumps. We didn't dump anything else. A lot of those that look like they're sitting at 0 are actually sitting at 1, though. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a subtle kind of distance between them, but there's some of them with 0. These errors I mentioned didn't produce any dumps. So here we have our virtual machine. It's not a hardened VM. It's just a basic VM, and it's very slow for some reason. When I plug in another monitor, it gets slow. Well, so we have the packer attacker. Can you see? Oh yeah, we have the packer attacker, and the packer attacker hook in the Windows folder. So they are in the path, and we have the dumps folder. Here it is. It's in the C drive. So now we can launch the Packer attacker. On the Citadel here is a banking Trojan. So, and when we do this, we see some stuff is going on here. It generates the dumps.
Do you want me to explain that?
Yeah.
So there's multiple different kinds of dumps. It's still going. Okay. So you see the ones that have like the notepad icon, those are just logs. You can see the process ID is within brackets. That's the same on dump. So in the brackets is the process ID in case we inject it into a new process. You can kind of trace back to where it came from. Then the next number you see after the underscore is just a timestamp. So we can tell how many milliseconds apart did we generate these dumps. That helps in analysis. That helps us tell if there were sleep calls and stuff like this that malware might do. It also helped us determine how long we need to keep the VM running for by checking how long most dumps come out. The next number is the start memory address, where it was unpacked to, whether it be memory address or whatever, PE header, where it was in the PE. And then the one after that is the end address. After that, so for this kind of dump, this is a dump that we detected with execute with our dep hooks. So we have the entry point after that, the offset into this dump, where the code entry point, where the code executed at. So then you can throw this into IDA and you can tell it the entry point is here and you're starting at the same place that the malware started at. So it's a bit easier to analyze than just jumping into the dump. There's other types of dumps we'll see, like if you look down to the WPMs, can you go down, Vadim, to the WPM? Yeah, these WPMs are just write process memory hooks. So we just dump the whole thing. There's no execution information there, so we don't have an entry point, but everything else is the same. There's also the .mvos.dump. That's map view of section. It's the same as the write process memory dumps, where we don't have any like execution state information, so we just give you the size and where it was.
All right, so I just wanted to demonstrate what was the effect of using the Packer attacker. So if we run, I'm not sure if you can see it. Yeah, that's good. So if we run, for example, strings on that malware sample, we'll see that there isn't much. And if we check the entropy and the section information, we'll see that there's a big region, big high entropy region, which is usually indicative of unpacking. This particular one is packed into several layers of packing, and the outer layer is UPX, as you can see here. So then let's copy these dumps back to the host, and I'll show you what to do with them, because we have quite a few. Wow, it's super fast.
Are you running the VM in pin tools?
Yes. So, okay. Now, if we, I'll probably put the mic here because I need my both hands. Yep, that's nice. Can you hear me? Yes. So, when we look at the dumps, we actually see that there's plenty of those. So, what Packer attacker does is just does what we explained. So it dumps everything it thinks suspicious, and up to an analyst or some sort of post-processing tools or scripts to figure out what to do with those dumps. But it's really easy. There's really nothing special, because first check you can do is you just can check it with the file, and you immediately can see that we actually were lucky enough to dump several full PEs. And also, as you can see, there are 2 dumps that are dumped from the memory, and then there's one write process memory dump. And what it means that there were several layers. At some point, it unpacked itself into memory, and then it ran, and then it injected into another process. So that you can get the idea of how the initial infection goes on. So, and if we look into that, one of the dumps is a memory dump we dumped from the heap. If we look at this, at the strings, we will actually find much more strings here. We can see the full import address table, some user agent strings, and so on. We're usually not that lucky. Well, sometimes malware has something like really interesting, like maybe URLs of the command and control servers, or maybe some indicators that are very useful for detection, for example. But most of the time it's something like this, and sometimes you don't see the strings. Although you packed the final malware payload, all the strings could be encrypted, and as well as the API function names, and resolve on the fly. And we have a couple of ideas what to do with it, but so far it's just as far as it gets. And if we look again, if we look at the entropy, then you'll see that it actually looks reasonably good. This is like a good entropy for a binary. It's just the green plot, by the way, is the frequency of FF and combined frequency of FF and 00 of these 2 bytes, because statistically these are most frequent bytes in the executables for Intel 32-bit. So it's a good kind of thing to plot and look. Okay, so what are the interesting observations we've made during this research? Well, half of the packers, at some point, they have the full PE in the memory, and we can dump it, and so it's easy to defeat, really.
And a lot of times we can take that. A lot of times we can take that PE that we dump, and we can just run it on its own. It's got no dependencies on the packer. It's like we can just throw it in OLI and analyze it, or throw it in IDA and have a full binary. Like everything's intact.
So on the other hand, we found out that malware is prone to crashing if we enforce DEP. It's weird. Maybe it's a result of bad design, because
theirs, not ours.
Yeah. Because malware is only supposed to work one way, the way it is supposed to, and when you start messing with it, it crashes. Well, I mean, it works for malware writers, I guess. And also another observation is that they have quite a few decryption layers. Well, not necessarily layers, but kind of decryption steps before the final payload kicks in, which is also interesting, and on its own might be a good indicator of malware. If you want to detect malware, for example, if you want to tell it from the actual binary, you can actually try to unpack it and see the number of layers, which is interesting. So let's for a second go back to the results. And so as you can see, dumped 87% is a good result. Doesn't mean that our tool is brilliant. Well, it's quite good, but the high success rate is mostly because packers are lame, kind of. You see, malware writers, they don't really bother writing advanced packers. The only reason they do is to bypass different, like various signature checks and so on. And for an AV, for example, on the host, they cannot afford to run the malware sample and to let it fully execute and dump it. So maybe these are good enough to bypass some AV emulators, but they're pretty bad they use the same kind of pattern that we exploit and we can dump. So that's why we have such a reasonably good success rate. So what's the future work? We're going to fix the crashes. Well, at least as many as we can. Then we have some ideas for anti-hooking, because at this point it's relatively easy to detect the hooks. And yeah, we're gonna implement the DLL support. These are kind of 3 main steps. Another idea we had is maybe make it as a Cuckoo sandbox module, but the problem is that they're also using hooks, and these might be mutually exclusive, but we're going to have to think about that. Yeah, I guess that's about it. This is the source code location. You can download it. Downloaded it there. Check them out. Fork or try to modify. And we very welcome your criticism. Go ahead and destroy us. Tell us how we suck and how we're doing it wrong, and we welcome that very, very warmly. Welcome that. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions?
Anyway, we ran this really, really fast, so we have plenty of time for questions if you have any. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, so the question was, can we elaborate on our anti-hooking methods? So there's like a lot of well-documented ways to do this. So since we know exactly what we're going to hook and we are kind of in control of the VM, like if we know the VM's Windows 7, for instance, we can write our own hooks where we put a jump in the middle of the function or something, somewhere where the malware is not going to see it, and we know what the state is, so then we could do something from there. Another thing we can do is, since as far as I know, all of the APIs we're hooking use system calls, we could just hook the system calls themselves. So we can scan the binaries, overwrite the system calls with an int3, catch that, do something like that. We can, I think there's KI fast system call. You hook that function, you hook every system call in 32-bit binaries on Windows. We could do something like that. Madshi hook is a library with a lot of good anti-hooking methods in it. So doing some reversing there could give us more information. And just, I'm sure there's been talks and white papers on it that I would research when we win about that. Anyone else? So I was actually thinking about that as we're going through the talk. The question was, have we run into malware that use vectored and structured exception handling? Have we run into problems? So I was thinking about that while we're giving the talk. Actually, it just hit me that like some of the errors we are getting could be because they're using these exception handlers to detect like VMs. Like common ways to detect VMs or detect debuggers is to throw certain types of exceptions and catch those exceptions. And if they're not caught, it means there's a debugger or something there. So we could be stepping on that in some place, but we haven't done research there. And malware also uses it for control flow transfer. So it'll like unpack to one place and then throw an exception with the exception handler address set as the address of where it unpacked to as like an indirect control transfer. We see that a lot. And as far as I know, we work pretty well with that, but I'm not sure about other reasons why they might be using it. We'll have to research that. Yeah, they can do that. So the question was, can they detect that detours is there and not unpack? And the answer to that is yes. That goes with the anti-hooking. Another thing we can do there is, since we're in the malware before it runs, it's suspended, right? So we can unlink from the module list so they don't see our DLL. We can hook whatever functions they're going to be using to read the memory from the DLLs to check if the bytes are the same, and we can spoof whatever we want. Of course, there's always ways around that, just like there's ways around whatever sandbox you can think of. But it's good enough because this is a small enough tool to where all the malware we run into doesn't know a thing about it. Like no one knows a thing about this tool. So right now it's good. In the future, now that we're releasing it and hoping people will start using it, we will have to think about this stuff.
Yeah, and one little remark: we have all these nice names here. So in the Git repo, we have all nice names like packerattacker.dll, the script called unpack.py, the guest script called agent.py. Of course, when you deploy it, it's recommended to randomize those names because for example, Cuckoo Sandboxer and some other sandboxes. Python scripts are also named agent.py, so maybe they will detect by that. But we only named it this way because for the clarity for people who read that code, for them to know what does that code do.
How high is your confidence that you enumerated all of the ways to write into the process?
So the question was, how high is our confidence that we enumerated all the possible way malware can unpack itself?
No, to write into process memory.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. It's hard to give you the exact number. There's nothing I can think of. So this is just based on our experience with malware, because I do malware analysis on a daily basis. These are things I most commonly see. And one of the reasons we made it open source is for other people, because we might be biased, because we don't have every kind of malware that's possible. And some people out there, they have their own data sets that might be different. And so we welcome to try our tool on their data set and give us the feedback. And we'll be happy to adjust the algorithm. But so far, this is the kind of the scope of the tool.
And to also address that, like he said, we're going with what we see. So I can already think of a few ways to do it, right? Like I might create a shared memory chunk in my process, write some stuff to there, it's not executable, then injects shellcode in another process that grabs that memory segment and gives it execution privileges and run it. As far as I know, we're not going to detect that at all. But no one does that at this point. And I probably just gave bad guys a good idea. But if they do start doing stuff like this, it's trivial to detect. The main thing we're worried about is if this becomes a thing malware wants to hide from. The easiest way is to hide from the hooks. It's not to come up with a new packing algorithm. It's not to rewrite your packers. It's not to do something crazy. It's to bypass the hooks. So that's why that's one of the main things we're thinking about fixing. Anyone else? Okay, well, I think we're good. Thank you for your time. It's been great. Hope to see you guys at the party tonight. Have a good one.
Thanks.